All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Archaeology Abridged of 2023. My name is Meredith Langwitz, and I am the AIA's Programs Manager. For those of you joining for the first time, the Archaeological Institute of America is North America's oldest and the world's largest archaeological organization, with over 200,000 supporting and subscribing members. From its founding in 1879, the AIA has been committed to supporting archaeology and archaeologists, publishing and disseminating the results of archaeological research, and providing programming, like this one, for a variety of audiences. We started Archaeology Abridged in 2020 when the pandemic-related shutdowns and quarantines prevented us from holding in-person events. Even before we started to emerge from the shutdowns of the pandemic, the need to continue virtual programming was palpable from all of the feedback we received from people all around the world. So we're still going strong with Archaeology Abridged, and we added AIA Archaeology Hour this past fall. If you aren't familiar with the AIA, we are a membership organization. Our programs are supported by our members. So thank you to all of our members out there today. And if you're not a member, please join us. You can read all about the benefits of membership and sign up on our website at archaeological.org/join. And by becoming a member, you can stay apprised of all of our upcoming programs. Speaking of upcoming programs, I'd like to give a quick pitch for a program we have coming up in just under 2 weeks. The AIA has over 100 local societies throughout the US and Canada, and likely one near many of you. And they come together via the efforts of our Societies Committee. Next month, the Societies Committee will host a virtual program they began 3 years ago. And the highlight of that program is a public lecture that will be given this year by Elizabeth Murphy of Florida State University. In the lecture, you'll get a chance to investigate the everyday working lives of ancient craftspeople through the archaeological evidence found in their workshops. If you'd like to register, please see the registration link in the chat. Beyond the support we receive from our members, the breadth of programming that the AIA provides is only possible because of our donors. We could not do the public programs like this or back archaeologists to support future discoveries without our dedicated donors. If you can, we encourage you to join this group of contributors with a gift, large or small. Again, you can donate right on our website at archaeological.org/donate. Please note, this is a live presentation. The AIA will be recording this presentation, but we ask that you do not. If you would like to see the recording from today's talk, we will post it on the AIA's YouTube channel within the next few days, and we'll send everyone that is registered today a link when the video is ready. If you joined us earlier this month for Kara's talk on absolute power in ancient Egypt and the modern world, today's format will differ quite a bit. Archaeology Abridged, as the name hints at, is a shorter talk. So Kara will give a 15-minute long presentation that will be followed by ample time for questions. We love your questions, and since there are a lot of you out there and the chat tends to get pretty lively as well, we ask that you use Zoom's dedicated Q&A box to submit your questions for Kara so that they don't get lost. All right, I'm so excited today to introduce you all to Dr. Kara Cooney. Kara is Professor of Egyptian Art and Architecture and Chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Her current research in 21st dynasty coffin reuse focuses on the socioeconomic and political aspects of funerary and burial practices in ancient Egypt. You may be familiar with her popular books, including The Woman Who Would Be King, Hatshepsut's Rise to Power in Ancient Egypt, When Women Ruled the World, Six Queens of Egypt, and the one her presentation last week was based on, The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. Kara also has a podcast, Afterlives of Ancient Egypt, which features discussions on ancient Egyptian history and society. She is active on social media, and you can follow her on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And we will add a link to her content in the chat now. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I know it's a tall order to ask an archaeologist to only speak for 15 minutes, so I'm going to let Kara get right into it. So take it away, Kara.
I love it. You're like, and Kara will speak for 15 minutes. And Kara's like, well, let's see how Kara does. So as we have said, as Meredith has said, we're going to jump right in there, and I will keep it to 11:20, she says confidently. But all of this is based on this book, and I'm putting this up so you know that all of the kings in this book are fair game as we move into the Q&A. But for today, I'll focus mostly on Ramses II. But all of the same tropes as discussed in the previous talks are in here. The idea that Egypt sold the optics of an absolute power, the best, arguably, out of anywhere in the ancient world, and solidified an ancient power for the longest, with the most continuity and the most monumentality of anyone else in the ancient world. And you see jealous rulers from abroad saying, how can I build that kind of thing? How can I get some of that? And so Egypt is this seductive place that produces and maintains long-term authoritarianism, where brutality is justified, where you have a strong leader who's always youthful and able to attract and impregnate many wives. All of this based on an elite patriarchal system. And I go into more details of how we live very much the same system today, though we might differentiate ourselves from the ancient Egyptians, think we are much more advanced than the ancient Egyptians. Much of my argument in The Good Kings is that we find ourselves living very much the same kind of political ideology. That's what I focus on. It is a political book. It is about how politics work, and it's about how politics shield themselves using ideology. And this is, I think, where things get a little messy, because many might assume that I'm attacking the ideology itself, and I'm not. But I am messing with the politics, and I am criticizing and sizing up and qualifying these different rulers, trying to understand their strategies, trying to see how they win, how they lose, and just how these things work, and how we are very much like them, trying to set up comparisons that we can understand them better. So Ramses II is our king of choice for today, and I think it works for a nice little, at this point, 12-minute discussion, because Ramses is so well known to us. He's somebody who feels rather modern, rather associated with a modern kind of political spin, as we'll see with Battle of Kadesh reliefs, etc. But I do talk about many other different strategies in the book, The Good Kings, trying to understand how politics worked in ancient Egypt and how ideologies were manufactured, manipulated, worked with to create the kingship that served Egypt so well and for so long. Now, Ramses II is a product of an empowered military, a military that found its legs. Obviously, the 18th dynasty started with a military rise. And before that, the 12th dynasty was a military coup, arguably, over a line of Mentuhotep kings. So I'm not saying that Egypt wasn't militarily based before, but I am saying that with the family of Ramses II, we see a set of new men and social flexibility such that generals could become kings. And you'll see that with Horemheb at the end of the 18th dynasty. This is according to our Manetho chronology, right? But he's disconnected from the family of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb is, just as much as he's disconnected from the family of the 19th dynasty and the Ramessids. But he is very much connected to the 19th in that he was a general, and he used that position to launch himself into the kingship. And this is what we will see with the first ruler of the 19th dynasty, Ramses I, and his ability to take his general's title and abilities and create a dynasty of family that then would launch after him into the kingship. The political situation is much more complicated, and thus we will move to the next slide, and I will show you that I am indeed focusing on Ramses II. And let's look a little bit at their mercenary origins, because this is very much a second or third generation immigrant story, if you like. It's a little simplistic. You know, we can talk about second or third generation immigrants in the United States, and I would be a second or third generation, depending on which side of my Italian line. I would be a second or third generation Italian American on my mother's side. I would be a fourth or fifth generation Irish American on my father's side. But as the generations go by and you embed yourself in a place, in a cosmopolitan place with many different kinds of people, you might bring some of that identity with you. And it seems the Ramessid family did, in a very interesting way, even maintaining a name like Seti, associated with the god Seth, the one of the god Seth, a god of great destruction and power and violence, like Mars in the Greco-Roman ideological system. So these mercenary origins of these Ramessid kings is something you really want to focus on. You also want to focus on the fact that these men, this dynasty of Ramses II, Seti the First, Ramses II, come from the northeastern delta. The northeastern delta, which shows a constant connection with the Levantine world, West Asia, over the Sinai Peninsula, for thousands of years. This is nothing new. But we're talking about men who are now finding their way to the very top, the very pinnacle of power in ancient Egypt as nothing less than god kings. And they come from this. And that's really interesting and very new in many ways. This is a story of new men, of social shifts, and just all kinds of norm breaking. And the way that this is happening in this newly opened and newly cosmopolitanized, arguably, New Kingdom, late New Kingdom Egypt, is that the institution of the army in Egypt is becoming more powerful than the general himself. That we're talking about the system being larger than the one person. Okay, that's fine. But we're talking about the system now being even larger than the king, that the institution of the army or the institution of the temple is now able to compete directly with the palace. And we see more interplay between the two. And thus it would make sense in this competition that you see in the 18th dynasty, that you would find the next king coming from that institution and finding his way to power through the war, through the income creation, through the vast riches that are manufactured through war. And one can argue through the very useful ideology that war creates around it. Think of the United States and how we venerate our veterans, ideologize our veterans, and have a Veterans Day and talk about them with great respect. And when people move against that kind of ideology, it is a third rail. It's very problematic. That kind of ideology is useful today, and it was useful some 3,000 years ago as well. Now, these kings are really interesting, these Ramessid kings. Here we see Seti I and his son Ramses II at the temple of Abydos in Upper Egypt, in the south. So a few points here. One, the south is where kingship had been forged and born for millennia in ancient Egypt. First dynasty of kings comes from the south, from Abydos, from around here, maybe Hierakonpolis too, but from this location. The 11th dynasty, when kingship is remade, comes from Thebes. 12th dynasty also seems to be a Theban kingship. 17th and 18th dynasty, when kingship is remade, also a Theban southern kingship. There's many reasons for this, and I have a new edited volume on Egyptian society out, and I talk about Egyptian geography and how that helps the Thebans to create this bastion of power to launch themselves into the kingship. But here we see men coming from the northeastern delta, not from this southern Upper Egyptian stronghold, but they're ideologically on the back foot. They know they need to infiltrate into this deep ideological web that works so well for Egyptian kings. And so what does Seti I do? But build a temple to many gods, but to the god Osiris in particular, at his mythical gravesite at the site of Abydos, in association with all of the god kings of the first dynasty. And so, and he sets up, what is it? This is a famous scene. He sets up Ramses II, and he claims his successor right away. This is another unusual thing, because the Ramessids are not just coming in and saying, we didn't have a past before. It's a very 18th dynasty thing where the king comes in, is invested as king, and there's no origin story. He becomes a real being to discuss once he is a king. The Ramessids bring their origin story of war making and generaling and doing all of these things with the army. And they bring a whole generation of men saying, we've got a grandfather, we got a father, we got a grandson, we got a whole lineage. And you see two of them here, and then you see them connecting to the entire lineage of past kings. From the first King Menes, you see in the top left, and then continuing on to all of the kings, except for those who must be excluded, kings that are aberrant in some way, like the female king Hatshepsut, kings like Akhenaten, Smenkhare. Those kings had to be removed from this list to clean it up, to ideologize it, to perfect it. But this is what this king, or this set of kings, the Ramessid family, knows that they have to go to the ideology first, go to the temple. Well, they're generals first, but then they have to go right to the temple to make sure that they create an ideological foundation for this dynasty. Now, when Ramses II becomes king, and I think those of you who have been to Egypt know this because it's kind of the Ramses II show, that Ramses II moves away from Seti I's high quality monuments. Like if you've ever been to his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Seti I, you know it's one of the most breathtaking things you've ever seen. Ramses II is like, nope, I need quantity. I need as many pieces as I can get, as quickly as I can get. And he reuses Amenhotep III pieces. This piece, this colossal here, is almost certainly a reused Amenhotep III, recarved. He recarves Middle Kingdom pieces, as you see here. And he claims temple spaces. He makes the front pylon his own, decorates it with a great battle scene that took place in his 5th year, and is making sure to set himself up as a celebrity. And this is the last main point I think we'll dwell on before we hit the Q&A. But I want you to think about, as I discussed in the last talk, and I said, here's a pyramid. We think it's built because you can, because these kings were so powerful. And why don't we argue that it's built because the kings were losing power and had to reinvent themselves? They're building it because of insecurity. Well, Ramses sets himself up as the celebrity king because he can, but also because he needs to, because he has to work with a group of people in a base, a military base, a priestly base, who as a block are much more important than he is, who are much more powerful than he is. And he must appeal to them. He must appeal to them as a populist ruler does. He has to give his base what it wants. He has to feed it what it wants, if you like. And so what you see in terms of the celebrity of Ramses II is, yes, he thought he was awesome. I'm sure if we had our time machine, we could go back in time and ask Ramses II, what do you think you are? What kind of are you important? Or we can imagine, right? But it also means that the system of kingship in which Ramses II finds himself is one that is beholden to bases of power that are larger than himself. So while you look at Abu Simbel and you're like, my God, look at 4 massive, colossal images of him carved out of the live rock. Yes, that's true. But this is also, for his military base, a pilgrimage site to go to a divinized Ramses when they're on their way to Nubia, where they're going to create havoc and extract and occupy. This is going to give them their connection, their physical human connection to their great leader, who will then reward them in turn. So I do like to reframe Ramses II as a populist, and that works very well for understanding this kingship a little bit better. Now, populism needs elites to work with as well. And when you're dealing with such hyper competitive systems, nepotism is often the short-term way to go. And Ramses II is no different. He puts his own sons in power, arguably his own sons-in-law in power as well. And this nepotism over time, works very well for his 69-year reign. But then as that reign ends, these sons, grandsons, great-grandsons will then be in competition against one another for a limited set of resources. And what seems to be the most extraordinary rule of the New Kingdom, with more statuary and temples put up with massive military victories, becomes a civil war between rival relatives, descendants of Ramses II, just a few generations after his death. So as I point out in this very complex, very human political saga, at the top of the wave is generally when the seeds of the destruction are sown, and Ramses' own need to be great is what actually devolves Egypt into a morass of infighting and civil war. And at 1121, and I think that's like, yeah, we have the big slide at the end, and we have a discussion of patriarchy, which we can skip over, but I think this is patriarchy in a snapshot, not anti-men, anti-hoarding patriarchal men at the top of the system. And it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that the book is about, and the kinds of things that I'm commenting on in terms of politics and ideology. And now I will stop my share, and we can jump into the questions.
You did it, Kara. And I mean, wow, what a force of nature. It's fascinating. I mean, I think if I wanted to start getting people to call me Meredith the Great, I would need a pretty good publicity and propaganda campaign as well.
Right?
But before
we all need a publicist.
Yeah, exactly. Before I get carried away with that, let's get right into the questions. As a reminder to everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the separate Q&A box that Zoom provides, so it doesn't get lost in the chat. Kara, propaganda seems to be universal in the quest for power and prestige, but the mechanism it is delivered through changes throughout history. You talk about all the temple inscriptions and the statues Ramses II had built, or more often modified, in his image. Would the average Egyptian in the lower classes have interacted with these statues, or is it kind of the propaganda filtering down, or do we not know?
No, it's a wonderful question. Essentially, the questioner is asking how much of Egyptian society did a given ruler need to convince that he was great? Mm-hmm. And I think that answer changes with time. And that's part of the reason for writing the book. How involved was Egyptian society as a whole? And it changes so much from, I do talk about Dynasty 1 a little bit at the beginning, this tiny little court of very privileged elites, where the common peasant really doesn't matter a whole hell of a lot. That moves into a discussion of Dynasty 4, where elites are empowered in a way that they had not been for the first time, and society broadens a little bit. Society's going to broaden a whole lot more in Dynasties 11 and 12, a little bit more again in 18. But by the time you get to this 19th dynasty, I can just intuitively throw out some percentages of what I feel in my gut we're talking about. That's not helpful. Demographics are, notoriously difficult. How are you going to count a population and know what your percentage is of high elites connected to the king? What's your percentage of workaday bureaucrats? What's your percentage of high priests versus workaday priests? How do you do that? My gut tells me that by the time it gets to Ramses II, I would say this autocrat needs to convince a base of like 15 to 20% that he's awesome. And then everyone else is, those peasants in the fields are connected to those fields and aren't really that worried or interested in what's going on. And looking at Egyptian history over a very long durée of time, you don't see any middle class until you get an industry of any kind, unless you don't see any riots in the streets, any sort of revolutionary grassroots resistance until late period at the earliest. So I would say like, 6th century BCE. That's super early. The most riots you get is Roman Egypt, Ptolemaic Egypt, Cleopatra, her father, Ptolemy the 12th. You get all kinds of riots in Alexandria. Because there's now a base that goes, I would say, beyond that 20%. You've got more people involved. And it's interesting that here we find ourselves in 2023, in which we're even more competitive. There's more people that arguably have a say, but things push and pull, don't they? Social inequality can become more of a problem and there's less people involved. So if we said, look at all of the competition and involved people in 1965, post World War II, compared to the minimum number of people involved in power and politics with a high level of social inequality in 2023. So these things, they change with time. Egypt is no different. But all I can give you is a gut reaction with demography. And for demographics, I'd look to articles written by John Baines. If I think of any others off the top of my head, I'll let you know. But it's a dark art, that demographic discussion. It's not easy.
So, and then you talked about Ramses having a lot of the statues changed to his image. Is there any evidence of any later pharaohs reusing his statues to promote themselves, sort of in a, turnabout as fair play, or?
Less than you would imagine. And I would say there's probably two reasons for this. The first answer is yes, you do, but not as much as you would expect. And one of the reasons is that when Ramses reused other people's statues or temple relief blocks, he would carve very deeply. So where an 18th dynasty inscription would be elegant, not too deep into the rock, beautifully carved, a 19th dynasty inscription of Ramses II or Ramses III after him, who did engage in reuse as well, is going to carve into a relief block that's this wide. They'll carve into it that deep for the text. So if you're going to reuse that block, you're going to have to take off this much text and your relief block is almost unusable. You might have to add a new relief block. So this reuse practice was defensive at the same time that they were reusing. So it's like, oh, you want to reuse? Well, try. So it becomes very problematic, but it's also really interesting how many kings after Ramses II or Ramses III, and there's no relation between the two, actually. They're of different lineages and of different dynasties. Ramses II is dynasty 19, Ramses III is dynasty 20. But how much later kings connected themselves with what had been built by those kings, saying that they were a good lieutenant or a good descendant of that king, rather than trying to necessarily claim it. You could argue that this was a reaction against the rampant reuse of Ramses II and or Ramses III, and that some kings who took power after were saying, oh, I would never do that. That's not my style, and are trying to set themselves up in reaction to what was there before. I was just talking to my grad students about how art history can teach you about politics. You can look at a statue and try to understand political strategy. It's totally possible. We could do the normal art history of connoisseurship and looking at how an eye is carved or making it all about religious ideology. Not that those things aren't important, but you can also talk about really scrappy political strategies by looking at statues, how they're carved, how they're reused, where they're set up, who gets to see them, how many people can fit in a space, all of this stuff.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting. That it's like, oh, I'm doing this, but now you can't. Ha. So we're going to jump around a little bit. You talked about mercenary origins, and we have somebody writing in that wants to know: do we know if Ramses II had ambitions to expand into Anatolia, or is there? I mean, in general, is there archaeological evidence of his ambitions being greater than he could realize, or was he able to kind of cover that up if it did happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cool thing that these mercenaries became kings at all, but it's not weird. In the Third Intermediate Period, you're going to see former sea peoples who call themselves Libyan and chiefs of Ma. They're going to become kings of Egypt as well. And then in the 25th dynasty, you'll see these Cushites who are very pious ideologues, but also very skilled generals. They'll come in and take Egypt's 25th dynasty and control Egypt from there. Now, did Ramses want to take Anatolia? That's a tough one. And I'm going to say no, though there may be fighting on that from some people who work with this material. The reason I'll say no is even more provocative. And that is, I argue that, and I do so in this book, that Egypt, including the Ramessids, are not really imperialists. This isn't a kingship of empire builders. It's a kingship of hegemonic rulers who want control of the Levant, who want it's for all of the resources and extraction it brings, and who want control of Nubia down south for all of the resources and extraction it brings. Things are more complicated politically in the Levant, arguably, than they are in Nubia. But that's an arguable statement. But they're not set up, Egypt is, to need to expand. They have so many resources within their own geographic borders that they don't need to go off and get too much besides tin. They've got most things within their borders, and they have a massive amount of people. The Nile is growing without too much trouble to look to. So there's not this organic need to expand that you'll see from West Asia, starting with Sargon of Akkad and growing, and then you just get empire after empire that gets bigger and bigger. Egypt expands to the Orontes. It expands down to the Fourth Cataract, and then that's kind of it. And it does so for very particular reasons that reward its elites and its king at the top of those elites, and then they kind of pull back. It's always out to those areas and then back. If you want to call that an empire, you can. I would rather call it a hegemonic base or hegemony, but it's not an empire that's expanding, that's including a multi-ethnic identity base of power. Everyone who comes in has to Egyptianize in many ways. It doesn't quite work in that way. So I wouldn't say that there's an inherent Egyptian need to invade Anatolia. They've got everything they want. They just want those Hittites to get the hell out of their space so that they can continue to rape and pillage and connect and have their vassal kings as they want. They don't need to go into Anatolia. Wouldn't even, they're no Alexander the Great, in other words. This isn't the way this system works. I'm not saying that they're not brave enough to be Alexander the Great. I'm just saying systematically, they don't need to. Alexander the Great needs Egypt when he goes because he needs that ideology. So he's out invading, and this is what his competitive system encourages him to do. And then Egypt's got to be included the same way it was for the Persian kings before him, because that place created the best ideology of authoritarianism, bar none, in the ancient world. So that's where they all have to go. They all have to. Julius Caesar goes there. It gets him killed. Mark Antony goes there. They all go there. They're like, oh, I'm a god. And it all turns horribly wrong. But
Sounds like it wasn't really in their scope. But okay, so here's another fun one for you. So since Ramses II outlived almost everyone in his kingdom, he must have seemed almost immortal. How did the kingdom manage to accept and get past his death? Is there archaeological evidence of disruption in the transition period?
I love this question. It's wonderful. First of all, you've got a kind of built-in prosperity gospel there, right? Because we simple humans, we think with our, particularly in the United States, with our puritanical predestination stuff, we're like, he was born rich. The God must love him and he will go to heaven and we will all rot, right? So we have these weird ideas of predestination in our own democratic American ideals, such that the rich man seems nobler than some of us who are baser and poorer and, God help us, intellectual, right? But but this wait, can you repeat the question one more time? Because I went off into base and anti-intellectualism and I lost my thread. Repeat it again for me, please.
Yeah, so I was saying that, how he outlived almost everyone in his kingdom. He might have seemed almost immortal. How did they manage to accept and get past his death?
Yeah.
And is there evidence of the disruption in the transition period?
Yeah, I go into these tangents and then I forget what the hell I'm talking about. The long reign of Ramses II, it feeds into that prosperity gospel of the ancient Egyptians, that he has this continuity. He is blessed by the gods. And it seems as if it is a gift. And it's actually become unfashionable to argue the long length of reign was anything that brought down a dynasty. Egyptological historians used to say this about the end of the Sixth Dynasty and about the reign of Ramses II, and say the long reign was the reason for the demise of the dynasty. And people would say, well, that's ridiculous. A long reign doesn't do that. And so people have very much pushed back against a long reign being a cause for any sort of end. But think of a long reign and what it does. Ramses II's living forever and ever. He has all these sons. The sons are dying before him. There's grandsons, there's great grandsons. By the time the man actually dies, 12 sons of his have died. He moves on to the 13th son, Merneptah, who's going to be king after him, who is already an old man. And out there on the political landscape with the nepotism, that monster that must be fed, are hundreds, if not a cool thousand of high level political players with their own entourages and everything, with equal claims to the throne in terms of their place in the hierarchy, their lineage, as the sons of the first 12 kings. I mean, are they important anymore now that their dads are gone? I mean, have they been passed over? It all goes to the 13th son. What about the grandson of the second son, or of Khan Waset or something like that? Those men had more time to move their pieces on the board, to pull in resources and loyal new men of their own, and even, as we will see at the end of the 19th dynasty, private armies. So I argue outright that the long reign of Ramses II was indeed a key to the destruction of the dynasty itself. And it's interesting to look at the political ideological landscape of kingship today, and to see Charles III ascending the throne at a very old age after the longest reign of his mother, Elizabeth II, and to see how, without even knowing why, we know that that's enfeeblement of this long-lived monarchy, not strength. And why is that enfeeblement, and how does that work, and what does it mean to be enthroned in your 70s? And then you've got this whole lineage of young men under you, and people are looking at that. It's very interesting. And I think more work needs to be done. And we are doing, I mean, people are doing it for the modern British crown, but I think more work needs to be done on how that would work in terms of society and competition of a growing, empowered set of entourages against one another. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that would you kind of fed into the next question, which asks about sort of you alluded to the short-term nepotism solutions causing long-term issues. Are there any good sibling rivalry stories that come out of that?
Sibling rivalry, like actual sibling rivalry of this time period, not that we know of. The siblings I can think of that are Egyptian kings are all there in the 17th and 18th dynasty, and they don't seem to be fighting against one another, but with each other. And indeed, at the beginnings of things, and when you're scrappily trying to create your base of power, the siblings seem to work well with one another. And you see this in the 25th Kushite dynasty as well, where the kingship is passed from a brother to a brother. Very unusual. But when you're really trying to create something new, moving to the next generation too quickly can be a problem, and moving laterally can be very helpful. Another really interesting question about how that took place, and why that would work, why going brother to brother would be useful. But age, ability, in a militaristic society where there's active fighting going on, brother to brother succession is more necessary. It seems then, I'm talking myself into this as I answer this question, that for the 19th dynasty, where you see a very strict father to son to grandson to great grandson, from Ramses I and on down to Merneptah, that strict patriarchal father-son succession suggests that there isn't any military competition that's overt that needs to be maintained that would require that kind of brother to brother succession. And Ramses II was probably really young when he was enthroned. He was probably a bratty, young, difficult king. We'll never know without our time machine. But it's okay to have that bratty, young, difficult king grow into his kingship, because you don't have anyone invading. Yes, there's issues with the Hittites, but really these things were brought upon the Egyptians largely, in my opinion. Now, when you get in the later part of the 19th dynasty, who was Seti II in relation to Amenmeses? We don't know. We don't know. They both must have been relations to Ramses II and or Merneptah, but how? We don't know. And were they related? Probably. So you've got this civil war between the older Seti II and then Amenmeses, who's really associated with the Theban base of power, whereas Seti II seems to be more of a northern Per-Ramses delta base of power. And you wonder, how this would work, what the relations would have been. It's not spelled out. And it might have been very confusing. Like if you look at a comparison to the Saudi royal family, for instance, and you see the relations there and the cousins with political intrigue against other cousins, and how MBS locked them all up in the Four Seasons until everyone agreed on how things would work. And he's much younger than all of these other people. It's interesting to see how those kinds of, dare I say, tribal politics might work themselves out within a family system of competition that uses formal military power and informal military power. Openly facing somebody on the battlefield, or a stab in the dark, or an assassination with poison kind of thing. All of those things are up for grabs. And the amount that we don't know about from the end of the 19th dynasty is probably a whole hell of a lot. So, yeah.
It's always good to be able to admit we don't know everything. Yeah, so there seems to be a lot of interest in Egypt's interaction with the outside world during the reign of Ramses II. So I know you talked about sort of the relationship with the Hittites and why they wouldn't have been interested in expanding into Anatolia, but someone's asking, is there archaeological or literary evidence of Ramses II interacting with ancient India?
Oh, I don't know, but I do remember, and I don't have this any place where I could give you. Maybe one could Google it now, and if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. But I know that there was an inscription of Ramses II found in the Arabian Peninsula just recently, and pretty deep in there, which is very cool. And it's a short boat ride, right? It's right there on the other side of the waters. So I can imagine that there were these connections. And of course, lapis lazuli comes from ancient Afghanistan, past in ancient Iranian areas. So the Egyptians they had connections with other elites. So it is possible that we have those kinds of connections to ancient India. But remember that for most of this period, the Ramessid period is a bit of an exception. You do have papyri from Deir el-Medina, a text from Deir el-Medina that talk about divorces and disputes and messy human stuff. But still, so much of the political story is sanitized. It is perfected. It comes from temple stone blocks. And that's why we are relegated to art historically deciphering a political strategy from a statue. It's the tools that we have to use, because authoritarian leaders are not writing down their strategy in the diary to have it published. It's something we might want and expect, looking at Greco-Roman competition, where such things are preserved, such machinations and human strategy. In a long-term authoritarian set of regimes, you're not going to see that kind of communication. Everything's perfected. So you're a super detective trying to figure out what the actual politics are beneath the perfected ideological veneer, which then upsets many Egyptologists, because they're like, how dare you upset this sacred religion? I'm like, wait, I'm not going after the religion, but there were real people in charge using this for their own, and there's politics here. So let's talk about that. And that's where things get really interesting, because we ourselves still get so wrapped up in the religion that we can't see the politics and how it uses the religion.
There's someone important from this time period we haven't mentioned yet today. Someone's asking, how powerful of an ally was Nefertari, and can you talk a little bit about sort of her influence over his ascendancy to power?
I love this question, because the comparison with Nefertari to Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut's daughter Neferure, to Nefertiti of the 18th dynasty is extreme. And if we're just looking at it superficially, what you see is Nefertari taking the place of the good wife, like the TV show, right? And Hatshepsut and Neferure and Nefertiti being those badasses who are within the context of a family dynasty, creating and taking power, real political power, sometimes at the top of the pyramid of power. Nefertari is like, I'm so pretty, and this is not mean for Nefertari. She's surviving. She's doing what she needs to do, right? But she's presented as the I'm so pretty, I'm so perfect, eternally youthful, I'm not saying anything political, I'm just there being beautiful and creating, like, you know, the beautiful parties. She's the good first lady. She's not the scrappy first lady who's getting involved in policy, for instance. And you might then ask, well, why is the 18th dynasty so different from the 19th? And in terms of human systems, it's very obvious. The 18th dynasty is built on a stronger base of family court power, so that the daughter of the king, the sister of the king, is empowered to help be an extension of that king's power. And as such, she can then build her own entourage and build her own palace economy, and then seize power in some ways, even in competition to the king. But in the 19th dynasty, what is the base of power? That family lineage, that family palace has been dispersed, it's been weakened, and the bases of power in the army and in the temple, they don't have time for women. They don't have, women only have a profession if they're a rich elite woman in a family who can create it. So in a place where professionalism, 19th dynasty time and place, is increasingly valued, the woman of ancient Egypt has no real place as a political leader. Now, those of you in the chat who are like, but what about Tawasret? And you would be absolutely right. And it's really weird that in this civil war, Tawasret, a very strong female, probably a god's wife of Amun, is then thrust forward as a female king. And in the middle of absolute fighting, and she was as scrappy as could be, and may have even killed the young man that she was regent for. All of these things are possible. How does she find her bastion of power? She comes through the family lineage. She's working as the wife of Seti II, we think, and then going from that from her family connection to create power. It is not successful. It's a very short-term attempt to create power. Who gets power? Who probably kills her and then starts the 20th dynasty? A warlord, a military general, probably a relation to Ramses II in some way. The guy is Setnacht, and he then creates a new dynasty, and Tawasret is just removed. So an attempt at 18th dynasty political female empowerment was tried, and it failed abysmally. And most females in the 19th dynasty are the good wife who's standing there by her husband's side and really doesn't have much empowerment at all. And you don't see female empowerment again until Egypt decentralizes into the so-called third intermediate period, 21st dynasty, maybe 20th dynasty. Nojmet's pretty badass. And then you start to see these females acting as extensions of their families to create power for their families. So this is a whole discussion of its own. And while I do talk about this in When Women Ruled the World, I don't get to talk about I talk about the female kings for the most part. And I do have an Audible original that talks about a lot of this, and it's called, like, it's got a boring title, like Powerful Women of the Ancient World or something like that. And so you might find that interesting. And I think it's free with an Audible membership. It's included. So you can check that out.
Hey, all right. Continuing with the power theme. You talked a lot about, for Ramses II, the base of the power being in the military. And someone's writing in, it seems like the priesthood could previously have really make or break a pharaoh. Can you talk a little bit more about Ramses II's relationship with the priesthood?
Yeah, it's super interesting how many bureaucrats, elites, new men are connected with both the priesthood and the military, and how much you see a back and forth between the two. So you actually see a staffing. I don't want to say this is across the board the way it's working. Things are very opportunistic, and you can't always see someone's origin story if they put up a statue in a temple, what they were before. But sometimes you can see somebody moving up the ranks in the military and then getting placed as the high priest in a temple. So there's absolute connections between the two, I would say, and there's dissertations done on this, that there's more that one can say. But I would make the quick and dirty conclusion that both are very, very powerful, and there's movement between the two. But in terms of political rule, the army is winning the day. And that doesn't mean, though, that Ramses II doesn't have to go to the priesthood for the ideological spin or veiling that he requires. But by the time they get to Ramses II, there's less insecurity. Seti the First, you look at that temple at Abydos and you see somebody who's trying to work with the priesthood, who's trying to ingratiate himself with the priesthood. You see that at Karnak as well. You can even see it in vestiges at Heliopolis and other places. By the time you get to Ramses II, you see a king who's like, I can make this priesthood and I will make it. And there is less of an insecurity, more of a claim of this as an extension of himself. Is that the actual reality? Hell's no, because after Ramses II's reign is over, you see the priesthood growing throughout the rest of the 19th and into the 20th dynasty as its own entity. And by the time you get to the 21st, beginning in the 20th, who's the king of Egypt for the great Amen priesthood of Thebes? Amen-Re, a god. And so you see, as the politics gets to be too much, they're just like, whatever, king of the gods is now our king, and we're going to set him up as our king in all practical purposes. And all these other Ramessid kings, some of them visit, some of them don't. One of them got killed in Thebes. That would be Ramses III. Not a lot of love for these Ramessids in the Theban region, one could argue. But this priesthood then just kind of ideologically creates what they need politically and ideologically out of whole cloth, and puts everything with the divinity. And that even continues into the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th dynasties, however you understand that mess of kingship. So it's a really interesting question. There's obviously more to be said, but think institutionally for this time period. Think institutional. Always think institutionally. No one man or woman is powerful enough to bend an institution to his or her will. We have to work with the circumstances we are given. Some are better at it than others, but the systems are certainly becoming more powerful than the ad hoc decision-making of one man by the 19th dynasty. Even at the same time that Ramses II sets up the optics of the opposite. Right? You look at Ramses II, you're like, he can do whatever he wants. He's God King of the world. He can set up statues everywhere. At the same time he's setting up that ideological fiction is the same time that he doesn't have it. That the systems, the institutions are growing much larger in a way that he has to ingratiate to him as a kind of superhero to get that, to be so popular, to be so beloved, and to hand out so much candy and trinkets and treasures and gold that he will never be questioned. So it's a dissonance, but that's how politics works, right?
Institutions.
By the time we see it for what it is. Sorry, go ahead.
I was like, institutions and knowing who you need to please. Yeah. All right. So we have another question. Yeah, I know last week you had mentioned that you can't say Ramses the Great without kind of like a side eye. Do we know if there were any other nicknames for Ramses II in antiquity?
I think it's possible that, I mean, I'm thinking of Amen-Messes, the Civil War, and one of his nicknames from Deir el-Medina seems to have been Messe or Messes, however you pronounce these things. I don't do Egyptian vocalization, so I'm not going to try that. And people make the connection to Moses and such. Did Ramses have such a nickname? I don't know. I would look to Aidan Dodson's book on ancient Egyptian royal families. He's the guy to go to for stuff like that. So sorry. Not off the tip of my tongue, but yeah, I'm sure there are.
No problem. I guess so. Building on the women theme, can you give us sort of some insights into if if you're seeing shifts in Egyptology as a whole to see if more of a focus on women? I know the Morgan Library currently has an exhibit, the oldest known writing by a woman. Do you see within the field? Do you see the shift to recognize women more? And is that sort of a shift in
absolutely. And I've just thought of another nickname, not of Ramses II, but Ramses III in his harem space, so-called harem space, and I'll stand by the word harem, with its orientalizing and misogynist meaning, because that's what the word means. It immediately evokes it. I say in service to the women who work there that we use it. But in the Medinat Habu space, I think Ramses has a nickname that the young ladies that he's fondling are calling him. So you could look there, and that's published on the Oriental Institute website. Look for Medinat Habu, Western Highgate, harem, and you'll go to town. It's some of the most fun research that you'll do. Very visual, not much text. But in answer to your question about women's studies, I mean, yes, a million times yes. It's been this way for a couple of decades. This isn't new. I think where my work differs a little bit is that I focus on women in power. And that's not to say that women who existed in the ancient world weren't survivors, weren't dealing with everything that they had with the circumstances that they had of having to be the mothers and producers of the next generation, the caretakers, all of these things. So this is not a takedown of female traditional roles that were imposed upon women by patriarchal systems, but to look at how ancient Egypt was able to push against systems of power and allow women to the very top of the social pyramid is very interesting to me. And thus I have a class at UCLA called Women in Power in the Ancient World, which you can all take in summer if you want and not be affiliated with UCLA. And in that class, you mentioned the Morgan Library exhibition for Enhe Duana or Enkiduana. I know I don't say it right according to the Akkadian specialist, and I apologize. But Enkiduana, she is situated as the world's first author, the world's first poetess, the world's first professional priestess, in a sense, and all of these things are correct. But then I come in and give it the patriarchal slam and say she's only there because she was placed there by her father, Sargon of Akkad, to use a softer, gentler approach to taking over a city that was not necessarily interested in working with him. So what did he do but work with the ideology, work with the temple, go in through a back door, veil his political intent with a woman who could raise no army, and a woman related to him, and a woman connected to ideological discourse, creation, connection, deep religious insight. This is not a slam to the religion, but it is an attempt to see how politics uses religion and uses women who don't have access to certain things in society as easy ways of creating power for themselves within the patriarchy. So, a lot of the work that's been done on female power is women can do it too. And it's true. It's a wonderful thing for us to see what half of the population was doing in the ancient world when we've been ignoring it for so long. But that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that we can create narratives that give a greater legacy to that power than it had. Because it'll be like, when I was growing up in the 80s and in 90s, it's like, another year of the woman and we're done. We are so far from done. And we need to use antiquity and how we teach it and how we work with it, how we research it in the same way. How were women used and misused by patriarchal systems? And that's my perspective. Again, no shade to the woman who divorced her husband, who beat her at Deir el-Medina, who's also got a side hustle making linen to create income for her family. That's awesome. And it's a power of its own. And you can tell that story. But I just like to bring a more straight ahead, rather tragic perspective to how women deal with the systems in which we find ourselves. I mean, Meredith, you know this. Here we are in late stage capitalist academia. The house is on fire. We're like the little dog going, this is fine. And this is when we get all the women into academia because it's burning down. Then they let us in and hooray, we get the house as it burns. And all the old boomers are like, wasn't like this in my day.
The Margaret Thatcher entrance. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I don't know if this is fair to do to you in 1 minute, Kara, but we had this question last week and didn't get to it. So I want to try to squeeze it in today. Why do you call them the good kings?
Oh, that's my sly. Why did I call the other book When Women Ruled the World? You know, did they rule the world? Hells no, but they kind of did, but they didn't, because I set it up and then I take it down at the knees. So I call them the good kings because that is what they call themselves. They are the perfect God, the good God. That's their word for themselves. How you translate Nefer, and I talk about this in the book, is complicated. Disagreements arise among Egyptologists, but they're using this word good. So I'm applying it and trying to figure out, well, what is good and how is goodness? You can't get more bland an ideology than that. How is goodness transverted, changed, manipulated so that people feel that they can subsume their power to this larger patriarchal system? And we're still dealing with that today. So all kinds of politicians, whether they're kings or presidents, set themselves up as the good choice, the only moral choice. And that's what I'm going for. And then people are going to pick up the book saying, I love Egypt. It's awesome. And they were so good. And then they'll start reading it. Like, what the hell is this?
Much to their horror.
Exactly. And it's a takedown of the political system. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, Kara, thank you so much. This was fantastic. For all of you here, again, if you'd like to watch this video, we'll have it on our YouTube channel shortly. If you missed Kara's talk last week, that is already on our YouTube channel. I would like to encourage all of you to stay connected with the AIA, become a member, support our programs. We'll keep you informed. Kara's talks this month are part of a larger lecture series. And we have 3 more speakers in the coming months, including our return next month with MacArthur winner and classical archaeologist Joan Breton Connolly, who will talk to us about her work in Western Cyprus, as well as tap into our collective experience with islands around the world to discuss why these landforms in the sea evoke an element of the sacred and the spiritual. Make sure you register for the upcoming talks to stay tuned. And finally, just thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for Kara for spending so much time with us over the last week and a half. I'm pretty sure this Q&A session has evoked even more questions. And I know we couldn't get to all of the questions sent in today, but I guess that's a good excuse to delve into your podcast and maybe some of your books, right?
Yep. Awesome. And thank you. Looking at all of the comments as you say more is great. Thank you for your attention and your intellectual capabilities. I'm very happy.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure and goodbye for now. And thank you everyone for joining us today.